This lecture is entitled Neoclassical Architecture in Europe. Now, hopefully you remember that last subunit we discussed neoclassical sculpture in Europe. And as you'll see today, the neoclassical exerted its influence on architecture as well, in similar ways. And you might remember that we looked at these two images that are on the screen right now when we discussed neoclassical sculpture in Europe. And we use this as a way to understand really what neoclassical sculpture wanted to move away from and the type of art it wanted to emulate, the kind of art it looked to for inspiration. So just to remind you of what we're looking at, on the left is Bernini's Pluto and Proserpina, and this is obviously Italian Baroque, 17th century. And they wanted to move away from that, and they looked to works like this image, which is a classical image of Apollo, known as the Apollo Belvedere. And what we see with Bernini is this dynamism, drama, emotion. We have really interesting spiral composition, moving away from that towards the more restrained and more simple composition, such as this. So we saw that and that's really boiling down to the bare bones here, but that's essentially what was going on in sculpture. And we see similar things at work in the architecture of the neoclassical period. And so here we have a comparison that's similar to the one that we just looked at. So this is what's going on with neoclassical architecture. This is a similar contextualization. So here is our Baroque example. And you might remember this is by Borromini. It is San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane. And it is also 17th century. It's Italian Baroque, quintessential Italian Baroque church facade. And architects working in the neoclassical period wanted to get away from this towards a greater simplicity. And this on the right, of course, is the Parthenon in Athens. And so this, again, is the 17th century example on the left, the Baroque example. And we have some of those telltale features of Baroque architecture. We have curving forms. Undulating was a word we heard a lot. We do have classical elements with cornices and entablatures, columns, arches, all of that. But it's a very complicated construction, and it's full of curving lines. It's busy. It's full of movement. And the Parthenon is the opposite of that in terms of the general mood. We have simplicity. We have an emphasis on what is simple about this. We have columns, just straightforward columns assembled in rows. We have straight lines, clear, defined lines. It's bold, straightforward, and I would say these are really very different interests at work. Neoclassicism. Let's get back to neoclassicism, the subject of this lecture. Neoclassicism wanted to move away from this Baroque style, which had continued into the Rococo, and return to this simplicity in architecture. And you might recall the words of Winkelmann, who we've studied, or Winkelmann, who was the first art historian in this period. And he saw this kind of art and architecture as what he called noble simplicity. So that was one of the ideas driving this period. So now, one of the leading architects in Europe at this time, working in the neoclassical style, was Jacques-Germain Soufflot. You should just remember his last name. And this is one of his most famous buildings over here. He was French-born, but spent a lot of time in Italy, studying, of course, classical architecture. And in a true neoclassical spirit, he borrowed from the classical world, but reinterpreted architecture through the specific perspective of 18th century France and the idealism of that period. Over here on the right, I have what you might consider the model, or what you might call the model for his building. So this is the Pantheon from Rome. It's from the 2nd century of the Common Era. And this is Soufflot's take on that, or it's the Panthéon. And it dates 1756 to 97. It's the same name, but you just pronounce it with a French inflection, Panthéon. And this is his take on this really famous classical example of architecture. And you can see he's really borrowing from that. We have the same essential characteristics, this wide front porch on both of these with the triangular pediment over the top, and then this prominent dome defining the central space. But of course, there are some really big differences too. And I think if you just step back and take a second and look at them and soak in sort of the details and the overall effect, you can see this. And one of the most striking things to my eye is the sense of weightiness in the original antique Pantheon. It's this massive, imposing, heavy-seeming building. Whereas Soufflot's version has this delicate, elegant, airy, and light adaptation. Notice the greater vertical emphasis, the really slender seeming columns. It seems less weighted down. So that's a really interesting take. And if you're really trying to copy the Pantheon directly, why would you have done that? Obviously, we know that neoclassical artists aren't directly trying to copy. So they're making their own versions of classical works. Other little interesting details. If you count the columns across the front of the original Pantheon, there are 8. Whereas in Soufflot's, there's 8, but there's kind of 6. This is really the border of the porch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But then on the outskirts of this first, of the main porch, there's this other sort of peripheral columns, right? So there's 8, but there's kind of 6. And that adds a little bit of depth and visual interest to the front here. It's also how the dome of the original Pantheon is hidden from our view when we're standing in front of it. So the visitor would enter the building and be surprised by this massive domed space. Whereas in Soufflot's version, the dome is this elegant top of the building, and it's very much visible and very much a part of the design of the facade. It's integral when you look up at the pediment. It's a part of this building. Soufflot is really, again, not copying classical architecture, but taking general features that it's quoting the Pantheon. We've got little quotes of the Pantheon, but in the language of the contemporary needs and tastes of 18th century France. And indeed, the sense of elegance and lightness in Soufflot's building suggests the influence of the architecture of France from as far back as the Gothic period. Again, that sense of verticality, height, lightness, that really does refer to France's own art historical past. And that is the essence of the neoclassical. It's that adaptation of classical features into the contemporary desires and tastes, and updating them and even improving upon classical features